All right, so here's our last part in the Chemistry of Organic Molecules lectures. So again, remember what we talked about with how molecules are formed. They're built and put together through the condensation process, and then hydrolysis breaks them apart. Then our body puts them back together, digestion breaks them apart, so on and so forth. And the groups of biomolecules that we've talked about, carbohydrates, mainly for energy, lipids or fats, cell membranes, shock absorption, insulation, and energy. And then proteins, metabolism, movement through the cell membrane, enzymes, transportation, etc., and eventually energy. And then our last group here, the last group to talk about are the nucleotides. Nucleotides are the building blocks of our genetic material. This is what we call the DNA. And then there's also some genetic material called RNA that we will be talking about and looking at a little bit here, but more when we get further on into the semester. So nucleotides are never listed anywhere in food labeling, nutrition, anything. But these are essential. Without nucleotides, you can't make DNA. You can't make a new cell. This is what makes the basic genetic instructions for all life. So nucleotides are composed of three parts. First part is a pentose sugar. So it's a 5-carbon sugar that we will find in the DNA of all living organisms. So this structure right here, this is the pentose sugar. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons making up this sugar. I call this a little sugar shack. I think it looks like a little house. Like that. Okay? All right, second component to all nucleotides is a phosphate group. All right, so our phosphate group is right here. To me, this looks like a little chimney sticking up here. So think about your chimney that comes off the roof of your house. That's our phosphate group. It sticks up towards the top of the sugar shack. Okay, that's part 2. And then the third part is going to be this nitrogenous base. Alright, so our third part, nitrogenous base, is going to be right here. Alright, so I always call this the porch. So you got a porch sticking off of your house. That's supposed to be our porch. So the nitrogenous or nitrogen-containing base, you have 4 options for your porches. A, you could have a T porch, a C porch, or a G porch. Okay, those are your 4 options. A, T, C's, or G's, making up these porches. Now when we look at DNA compared to RNA, there's a few small differences. I'll get into those more in a little bit here, but just briefly, the sugar shack, the little house in DNA, is called deoxyribose. When we look at the RNA molecule, it is called ribose. Okay, so that's one difference. The sugar shack, they still both have a porch. They still both will contain this chimney or have this chimney. But the sugar is a little different between DNA to RNA. The porches, there will be a little bit of a difference in the porches. When we look at ribose and the RNA, it uses the porch letter U. It will keep A, it'll keep C, it'll keep G, but it uses U instead. And then the RNA structure is going to be a single strand. Okay, so I'll show you that in a little bit here. But here's the overview of the DNA. This is a structure that contains our genetic material. I don't care what you are. Bacteria, fish, frog, fungi, plant, animal, etc. We all have DNA. The volume of DNA is what really determines the species. We have roughly 6 feet of DNA per cell in the human body. Other species have more, or other species have less DNA. That's what makes species different. Now, what makes individuals different? Why do you have brown hair and somebody else has blonde hair? It's the information contained in your DNA. The individual A, T, C's, and G's, that pattern and that order. So we'll get into that more in the genetics unit. This is just laying the foundation here. Okay, so there's the overview of our DNA strand. It's called a double helix. When we're looking at the bases, the porches associated with DNA and then RNA, we'll see in DNA you can have an A. There's our A porch. We have a T porch. We have a C porch. And we have a G porch. Those are all your DNA porches. Okay, so the yellow highlight represents, oh, that's not going to work, represents the DNA porches. Now, when it comes to RNA, oh, let me messing this up here. All right, DNA. All right, yellow represents DNA porches. So ATCG. When it comes to RNA, RNA uses the porch uracil. It can also use the porch cytosine. It can use the porch adenine, and it can use the porch guanine. So RNA, I'll put this over here. RNA letters, there's RNA. Those letters, for their porch, because their sugar's a little different, their letters are A, U, C, G. Okay, so that's a little bit of a difference between DNA and RNA. And structurally, when we look at RNA, we have a single strand of information here. We don't have the double helix we had in DNA. RNA is the code that turns DNA into a protein. It's an intermediate. So we'll come back to this, but I just want to set the stage now. DNA acts as a menu. DNA becomes RNA. RNA then determines your amino acid chain or your protein. So we just got done talking about proteins, taking a look at protein shapes and structures and how that is determined by your information in your DNA. So here's a normal protein. Looks like a nice tube in the cell membrane. There's our cell membrane. That protein allows molecules to diffuse into the cell or diffuse out of the cell. But if that protein is bent and it's shaped differently, now these molecules do not have the ability to diffuse through that membrane. The reason why you build a bent protein versus a straight protein is because of what's found up there in your DNA. This dictates that, which then dictates that. This here is cystic fibrosis. You have a bent protein because there's a problem in your DNA. But DNA codes into RNA, RNA codes into the particular protein. And remember, with protein, shape equals function. Proteins are made up of all these little amino acids, those little chains of amino acids that we were looking at. Single, double, triple, quaternary shaped proteins. All that is determined by this information going into this to then becoming this. Okay, so we'll get into this more. We'll come back to this. I just want to introduce this now so when we get into genetics later on, it's not a crazy, wow, we've never heard of this concept. The important nucleotide to drill into you guys right now is the nucleotide ATP. Okay, so ATP is energy. This is how all living things get their energy. I don't care what you are, fish, frog, etc. Energy is required by all living organisms. It's one of those features and properties of life we talked about. Every living thing needs energy. Our energy form is ATP. So if you look at it, got the sugar house right there. We have the porch. This is the adenine porch, the A porch right there. And then here's our chimney. But the difference with ATP compared to DNA and RNA is we have 3 chimneys stacked on top of each other. So 1, 2, and 3. They're all stacked up. And in order to hold this chimney together and then this chimney together, there's a bond. That bond has a lot of energy in it. It's a high energy bond right here, that bond that'll hold those 2 chimneys together. But that's what creates ATP. It's like a loaded mousetrap, a lot of energy there. Cell reactions, cellular processes, metabolism, regulated by enzymes, which are proteins, break that bond. And when this bond right here is snapped, that phosphate pops off, it releases energy. This is the energy that sustains and drives life, right there. So when our heart beats, it's because of this energy right here that was released when that phosphate got broken off. So ATP is the essential form of energy for all life on Earth. I don't care what you are. How we get ATP varies. Are you eating it? Are you doing it through photosynthesis? Are you doing it through a different chemical process? There's lots of different ways to get to this ATP, but we all have to get there no matter what, or we're not going to survive. So when we talk about metabolism and get into metabolic pathways and energy production pathways, this is the structure I want you guys to remember. I want you to remember how this structure is formed, what it is, the makeup of it, the components, the sugar shack, the adenine, the 3 phosphates, because we're going to come back to this one. Okay, so give it a little red star over here. Make sure we're good with what ATP is and what it does and how it works, because we will see this again.